So we're going to try and cover Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther tonight, and this is our grand finale, so there's no better way to finish off than with these three books. And I know I have, I think I'm missing Daniel background after I was going through it in my head, so we'll get Daniel next week, and then we have three more prophets, or two more prophets actually, plus Daniel, and then we have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther background for those. I'm finishing those off, so I'll get those to you all, and then we should be caught up with outlines and background to every book in the Old Testament, and praise God we got through that.
Yeah, the leftover handouts haven't been thrown away, have they?
No, they're all floating. Most of them should be right here, so
I'll figure out how to
if you want to rifle through that, but yeah, I'm already planning next time through how I'll do it, but you know, we tempted to do this in a chronological order as far as following God's progressive revelation, following the narrative. And I don't use that in a contemporary sense, I use that in the archaic sense, but following the narrative of the Old Testament and the storyline, and then complementing that storyline where the books fit in. I will change next time through, though. I'm already going through my head and making adjustments for next time around, because we're always refining it to make sure that we're more accurate. But next time when I go through it, when we talk about cover Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I will cover the prophets of the divided kingdom and the single kingdom in that period. It's a little more befitting because of the context that many of them came in, like Obadiah and that. And it helps us then to see the big picture and where they fit in the grand scheme of things. Because oftentimes that's the problem with the prophets is understanding where do they fall and all that's happening. And when we understand the historical background, it makes it easier for us to interpret and to understand what's going on. So I'm going to attempt to do that next time around. And we'll continue to add to our notes as we go. And the plans are that I will do a New Testament survey. The requests have been sent out, so we will do that. But I will go to intertestamental period, and I will start from there actually. So we will go back and pick up some stuff from Daniel, and we will cover into the intertestamental period and then walk into the New Testament period. So that will be a big undertaking. I've done a New Testament survey before, but not to the extent I've done Old Testament. So I'm thinking ahead and going, man, that's a lot of work. But it'll be good in the end when we get through it. But so I will spend till fall. And fall is when I plan on doing it, because then that's sort of when we start going into hibernation mode anyway. So it's a good time to do stuff. So we'll cover it then. So let's look broad picture, big scope. When we look at the layout and the framework, and most of the prophets that we've covered were during the divided kingdom, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, and we talked about the Assyrian captivity in 722 BC, and then the surviving kingdom, but they're going to be taken off into captivity into Babylon in 586 BC, and that is not the first wave. The first wave comes in 605, then 595, then we have 586, which is the final, and that is when there's going to be the destroying of the temple and all of that. And so that is why we hang on that particular focus. But we've walked through these different periods. We've walked through the era of formation, and we've looked at, starting with Abrahamic covenant, all the things that God promised, but the primary thing looking at God's promise to Abraham is that he would be a great nation, and it involves people, land, and law, or reverse that order. And so we have the people element, Exodus, then they come out into Mount Sinai, they're given the law, and then God is going to take them to the land. We walk to the era of theocracy, the era of monarchy, and we're going to move into the era of restoration. We look at Ezra and Nehemiah, and the reason why we put Esther alongside is because her lifespan, the things that happened in her life occurred between chapter 6 and 7 of Ezra. And so that helps us to sort of understand. I mean, a lot of these lives overlapped, right? wasn't like this happened, then this happened in this book, then this happened in this book. And there were, especially with a lot of prophets, they were contemporaries. They were ministering at the same time. You have Daniel, who is higher up in the echelon of Babylon, and he has the influence that way. You have Ezekiel, who's also prophesying in Babylon, but his message is also going back to those who are still in Judah, awaiting the final destruction. Coming of the Babylonians when they would destroy it in 586, but they're both ministering in Babylon, one at one end, one at the other, and yet there was enough to go around for both of them, right? And so we see that there's overlap of their lives in that, and it also helps us too then when we deal with the prophecies. Well, the people weren't ignorant of Daniel's prophecies, they knew his prophecies, so it fits in with what Ezekiel's talking about and so on. And so we see this happening, and also it's good for us to understand the big picture of what's going on in the lives of the people that are here. When we're talking about Ezra, we're going to look at the restoration and reform, but it's interesting because Ezra, when we look at the years covered in the book of Ezra, we had Buddha in India, we had Confucius in China, and we had Socrates in Greece, all in the lifespan of Ezra. Right? And so, I mean, we've sometimes failed to see biblical history in light of overall history, and it's recording actual history, and wherever the Bible speaks on certain subjects, it's true and accurate. So when it speaks to things of science, it's true and accurate. When it speaks to things of math, it's true and accurate. When it speaks to things of history, it's true and accurate. Sir William Ramsay, I love his story because he was just so set out to prove Luke wrong in his recordings in Luke and Acts. And in the process of trying to prove Luke wrong, he ended up coming to Christ, and he ended up writing a series of books that were rather amazing and have shed great light on the historical framework and of what was referenced to in Luke and Acts, and also in some of the epistles. And so we see that all of that is important. So we'll look at Ezra starting off, and just the background. The Persian Empire, I won't get into great detail, but Cyrus II the Great started in 559 and reigned till 530 BC. Now, some would put his date for his reign at 550, but it actually started before that, because he started to reign over the Medes, then he reigned over the Persians, his combined kingdom of Medo-Persia, and that was in 550 BC. So he began his move long before that. So he was the founder of the mighty Persian Empire. He ascended to the throne of Anshan in 559 BC of Astyages, and then he conquered him, and then he took over Ecbatana about 300 miles north of Susa, which is now known as Hamadan. And then in 550 BC, he became the emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then in a series of reigns, we have Cambyses II, Smerdis, we have Darius I the Great, Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, and then we have Artaxerxes, also known as Artashasta. And some of these names, it kind of throws us off that they have two names, but for many of them it was their regal name. Tiglath-Pileser was actually a name that was taken over from a predecessor. And the predecessor was so victorious and strong and powerful ruler that this title was taken over, when originally Tiglath-Pileser's name was Palu. And that's how he's known, and we actually have him referenced as that in the Old Testament, but he took on this title for himself. And so it's not unusual for these monarchs in those days to have several titles. Some of them conferred by their enemies, some conferred by their subjects, some taken on by themselves. Some it was just nomenclature, something that they did, and then they had their normal name that they were given. Introduction, the place in the canon, we talk about the book of Ezra. Its place is pretty significant. In the English Bible, Ezra follows 2 Chronicles. In the Hebrew canon, Ezra and Nehemiah are considered as one historical book. Josephus refers to them as one. Jerome and also the Talmud under Baba Bathra refer to them as a single book, but there is sufficient evidence to suggest that they were actually two separate books. Even in my Hebrew text, they are combined together as one book. They bear the name Ezra and Nehemiah, but they're combined as one book, but there's reason to believe that they were actually two separate books. And this is just a reminder, you know, when we look at inspiration pertains to the recording of the content that is in the Scriptures. It doesn't have to do with the aspect of how the canon is put together. In other words, it has nothing to do with the order that we have in our English translations, has nothing to do with the order in the Hebrew text. right? Those are things that man has done over time. He's put them in certain arrangements and orders, and they vary. And the variance would tell us that it wasn't divinely inspired. And so we can look at them and see the ordering, and sometimes the Hebrew ordering is very fascinating, and you ask yourself why. And even when I did the introduction and I gave you the reasoning behind the English ordering, very fascinating because it's all focused around Christ. Yet that's man's device and design, not God's design. And so when we come to study these books, they weren't meant to be read in the Hebrew order. They're meant to be studied, I think, in the chronological order, God's progressive revelation order, right? And the order in which they were given. And when we follow that, then we follow God's game plan. And the narrative becomes very clear, and the lives become very clear, and what's happening becomes very clear. That's why New Tribes, one of the things that they were so known for early years was they would do that. They would start from Genesis and read to Revelation, and they would try to do it in a very chronological order. And it was interesting because the first attempts at it was so moving because they would read to these tribal people, and by the time they get to the New Testament, they're crying out for, when's the Messiah coming, right? And they're looking for, right, what was expected in the Old Testament. But see, that's following the order in which God gave things in, and so that's why we try to stick with that. But these bits of information are very interesting. Yeah?
Well, where would you say Ezra would fall then?
So he would be in that final era of restoration. Yeah.
Well, that'd be back there.
Yeah.
Is that just the way I'm thinking, or?
Well, in our minds, we're so used to seeing our English order that it's hard for us to sort of imagine them in a different order.
Okay.
But in the progression of things, Ezra's at the time of restoration because they're in captivity, and then there's going to be 3 waves of return to Jerusalem. So they are to Judah. They're going to come in, and so you have the first move that happens under Zerubbabel. Then the next one happens under Ezra, and then the last one's going to be with Nehemiah. And so they are at the end of restoration, and then they are going to set the scene for the last prophets that come, Malachi or Malachi being the last one, and then it moves us into the New Testament era. So what throws us off is when we memorize the books of the Bible, we do it according to our English order, and then we study them in their historical order. It sort of throws us off a bit. So that's why we try to go back to the historical order of things. The purpose of Ezra, the book of Ezra, shows how the Lord fulfilled his promises given through the prophets to restore Israel to their own land. He moved heathen monarchs to show favor to the Jews, raised up leaders like Zerubbabel and Ezra, and prophets like Haggai and Zechariah for the grand task of restoration. And we're going to have reference to them. Notice with me in chapter 5, we have when the prophets, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Now, they came in to encourage the people because there was a lull in the work on the temple. They ran into some opposition, so therefore the work came to a standstill, a 16-year standstill. That's a pretty lengthy standstill. And they were to come and minister to the people. The focus of Haggai, he dealt with encouraging Zerubbabel, but he also dealt with, confronting the people, because the problem is they became so settled and started focusing on building their own homes, they forgot about God's house. And so Haggai was to call them back to attention of they needed to focus on the Lord's things first. The restoration involved 2 aspects. The first was the physical aspect, moving back to the promised land and rebuilding the temple. And then the spiritual aspect of restoring true worship, reestablishing authority of God's law, and initiating reforms in everyday life of the Jews. This is why Ezra was so important. And Ezra 7:10 is such a key verse. When he talks about the fact that Ezra set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to practice it and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel, Ezra 7:10 has been sort of a driving force for me in ministry and life, because you see the impact that it had. And the most amazing statement in that whole verse really is the first word, for. Because it goes back and explains why the good hand of God was upon him, because Ezra set his heart to do this. There needed to be this restoration. They needed to uphold the authority of God's word. There needed to be that restoration. And therefore, they needed someone like Ezra, who was committed to the law of the Lord, to studying it, to applying it, and then to teaching it, to be the one to go there and to lead the people in the way of God. So he was vital in the process of restoration that was to take place. Key elements in the book of Ezra, key words, spiritual restoration. Key chapters, chapter 6, the rebuilding of the temple. Now it begins earlier than that. They're going to return earlier than that, and they're going to start working on the temple, but it's going to come to a law. They'll start in 536. They're going to come to a stop in 520 BC because of opposition. 16-year law, and then they're going to pick up the work again. They're going to finally finish it in 516 BC. The key verses, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and chapter 6, verses 14 through 15. And then the key characters, Zerubbabel, Joshua the high priest, and Ezra. And then the geography is Babylon and Palestine. So essentially the first part of the book is divided up as Zerubbabel's return, and then the second part of the book is Ezra's return. And it's interesting that there isn't much attention given to the journey back. It's all the precursor that's focused on what took place, the cleansing, before they left, the prayer, the committing themselves to the Lord before they go. All of that was focused on more than the journey itself. But we have three ways of return. We have 536 BC was the first return under Zerubbabel, 458 BC, the second return under Ezra, and then 445 BC, the third return under Nehemiah. The first return in 536 BC had to do with Cyrus. The next two returns, the second and the third, were under Artaxerxes. It's amazing how God uses foreign unbelieving powers to fulfill His work. And not only that, but to provide for His people. So my cousin was in the mission field, and back in those days they were ministering to nomadic people, which is a very tough ministry. But they're in Africa and they're out in the middle of nowhere, and it's several days before you can even get to a major city, any kind of city really. It's just barren wasteland. And they were traveling into a city and their truck broke down. Well, in the area, there was fighting going on, war going on. And one of the armies, the military that served in that area, were not known for being very kind to travelers journeying through. Usually they were robbed, whatever they had of any worth was taken, and they were either killed or just left to defend for themselves. And my cousin's truck had broken down, and here comes this military force the next morning, early morning, up upon him, and he's sleeping up on top of his truck because of lions and that. And he's out in the middle of nowhere. And so here they come, and it's interesting because the commander of this squad that had come out and encountered my cousin actually commanded his men to take my cousin's truck back to where their base was, to fix this truck and to get him on his way. And it's interesting how God can just work with these pagan peoples and these kings and rulers and all of that. He's going to fulfill His plan, right? No matter who it is, He is under control. And as we looked at Daniel, God rules the world. That is the overriding idea of Daniel. And it is something to be mindful of when we look at the captivity and then the restoration is God is the ruler of the world. And so He is going to use these monarchs, Cyrus and Artaxerxes, to provide a means for the people to return and to establish themselves in Jerusalem. So we have the first return and rebuilding under Zerubbabel, and this is chapters 1 through 6. And again, Esther is going to fall between chapters 6 and 7, and we're going to look at her after Nehemiah, but just keep in mind that that's where her life is taking place. But we had the decree of Cyrus in chapter 1. Persian Empire defeated, took over the empire of Babylon in 539 BC. It was pretty abrupt. It was really quick. And we have record of this, right? We have record of this account of the taking over of Babylon and capturing them. The Persian government had established itself but still desired loyalty of its new subjects. And so one of the things that they would do is they would allow their peoples to go back to an area, to resettle it, to establish themselves there. And they also hoped to curry the favor of their gods. And that is essentially what Cyrus would be thinking and hoping, and that is what we find in the record of the conquering of Babylon, and also we have record of him allowing peoples to return to resettle their area, was hoping that the gods of those peoples would be there to defend and protect and to maintain the rule of Cyrus. So Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, rebuild their temple, and I love that the temple was the first thing, right? They go back, they're going to do the altar, then they're going to do the temple, then they're going to worry about the walls and all of that other kind of stuff. But first, it was worship they needed to deal with. So in chapter 2, we have the return to Palestine, and those who were willing to leave Babylon returned to a land that was desolate. And we have a careful listing of those who returned. Zerubbabel led a group of almost 50,000 back again. This is in chapter 2, verses 64 and 65. And if we look at all of those who are recorded there, it comes out to about 50,000 people returned with him. And again, we have several waves of returns that happen. Then we have the rebuilding of the temple starting in chapter 3. Here's something that's interesting before we move into chapter 3, but notice at the end of chapter 2, priests that were removed from this order in 61 and following. Notice with me, of the sons of the priests, the sons of Habiah, the sons of Hakkoz, the sons of Barzillai, and he took a wife of the daughters of Barzillai, a Gileadite, and he was called by their name. These searched among their ancestral registration, but they could not be located. Therefore, they were considered unclean, excluded from the priesthood. This is very fascinating because genealogy was crucial. Knowing your ancestors was very important, and they kept a serious record of these things. And so when they were returning to the land and they're going to have priests serving, they want everything to be squared away and right. So those who may have been serving in the role of priest in the time of captivity, they weren't going to do so when they returned to the land, or maybe that their family line was serving before the captivity. But it's interesting because then you look at Zacharias and Elizabeth, right? And both of them came from a priestly line. And it's so amazing that all this time span, they could still trace their lineage, right? John being from a purely, right, priestly line. But it's just fascinating. They were so concerned with making sure that everyone was in the up and up and they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. So we move into chapter 3, and the altar is established first. They arrive in the land. They're going to rebuild the sacrificial altar. And then after that, they're going to start laying the foundation for the temple. We find this in 3:10. Now when the builders had laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests stood in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, and to praise the Lord according to the directions of King David of Israel. So this was the first thing that was to take place, so that they were going to build the altar, then they were going to rebuild the temple. But they encounter opposition in chapter 4. And this opposition isn't going to just go away over a short period of time. Not everyone was glad to see them return. There was this first initial, hey, we want to be a part of this. But the leadership was straight and clear at saying, no, you have no part in rebuilding this temple. You have no part in worshiping here with us. And so the opposition began. And in chapter 4, verse 5, notice with me, and hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So it lasted about 16 years, this opposition, where they came to a standstill, the building of the temple. They were going to do whatever they could to thwart their progress, so they hired counselors to get in the way, to hinder them in the law courts, to keep them from doing what they needed to do. And during this time, God rose up prophets to come encourage the people to get back to the work that they needed to do. And then we have in chapter 5, we have the return to building. We have the ministries of Haggai and Zechariah as they encourage the people to keep on with what God has set for them to do. And so they set out to rebuilding the temple. And they challenged them, they motivated them. Again, Haggai challenged the people, look, you're focusing on your own homes and your own houses. You need to be focusing on the house of the Lord. Right? Far too often. I mean, Haggai is such a great message for us today, and even Habakkuk. Habakkuk is like opening up the daily paper, really. The messages that those two prophets have would do us some good to spend time there. But Haggai, it was just a reminder of the fact that, look, we spend so much time taking care of our own house rather than taking care of God's house, or taking care of our own family life rather than taking care of God's family life. And so often we get distracted, and the people did. They came to understand that they had been disobedient and unbelieving, and even though the circumstances had not changed, they went back to work and saw God work on their behalf because the opposition didn't cease. They complete the temple in chapter 6 of Ezra. And this is going to bring us to the end of the first phase of returnees. But after difficult years of hard work, the construction was finished. The temple was dedicated in chapter 6, verses 14 and following. And this is about 516, 515 BC. So we had the temple started in 536, came to a stop in 520. It's then going to be resumed at that time, and it's going to be carried on until 515. Then we have the second return and reform under Ezra, chapter 7 through 10. And it's interesting because we have this brief beginning of this notation of a journey by Ezra, but again, there isn't a whole lot of attention given to the trek. I mean, it's a lengthy journey that they're going to travel from Babylon back to Palestine, but there isn't a whole lot of time given to that. Most of it's given to the preparation and the character of Ezra and his lineage and those kinds of things, but not really focusing on the journey itself. So in chapter 7, we have the decree by Artaxerxes about 80 years after the first return under Zerubbabel. Ezra the scribe is going to return. His purpose of going to the land was to bring about substantial offering to help the people there and to teach them the law. So he brought back stuff to help them in the process of what they were doing, but more importantly, he brought back a focus on the law of God that the people needed. And we see the impact of his ministry in Nehemiah, and that's why when we looked at Ezra chapter 7, we went over to look at Nehemiah and the impact of his ministry and the effect of the Word of God in their life. But we have the return to Palestine then in chapter 8. This gives us a little synopsis of what happened before he journeyed there, the things that took place in their preparation and leaving, as far as lining up Levites and things that they needed, preparing themselves, purifying themselves. And these are things that were necessary for Joshua before he took the people into the promised land, and therefore Ezra did the same thing with the people before they headed back into the land again. So the people of the land were glad for the financial relief brought by Ezra, and Ezra was delighted to finally see Jerusalem. And then we have the Reformation under Ezra in chapters 9 through 10. And he's primarily, what we have listed here is dealing with the issue of mixed marriages, which is very interesting, but it's just fascinating, his response in regards to his prayer. And it just never ceases to amaze me how he includes himself in the prayer, although he was not included in the sin. In other words, he recognized the fact that he was part of a community people. And so when he's dealing with the issue of mixed marriages in chapter 9, notice with me in verse 5, "But at evening offering I rose from my humiliation, even with my garment and my robe torn, and I fell on my knees. I stretched out my hands to Lord my God, and I said, O my God, I am ashamed and embarrassed to lift up my face to you. My God, for our iniquities have risen above our heads, and our guilt has grown even to the heavens." But notice how he talks about our iniquities and our guilt, but he wasn't involved in their sin. But yet he identified himself with them, and he understood the impact of sin. It wasn't just on the individuals, it was on the community as a whole. And especially, when you're thinking about these kinds of things, mixed marriage, when you're talking about marriage and that relationship, there's certain sins that may not seem to affect other people. You can tell a lie and it really affects no one but you, right? Oftentimes. Or you can steal something and the consequences really only affect you, really, for the most part. But it's interesting to me that when you get into sins between a man and a woman and marriage and those kinds of things, it affects all kinds of people. It affects not just the immediate family, but also the remote family, right? It doesn't just affect your life, and Ezra recognized this. Unfortunately, the people of Israel were once again beginning to compromise God's laws, especially in the matter of marrying pagans. Going back to Deuteronomy, right? That's one of the things that was stipulated. You do not intermarry when you go there. Ezra knew the law, and he knew the history. He knew that if the situation was not dealt with, more disciplinary action from God would be forthcoming. It was a broken-hearted man who cried out to the Lord and mourned greatly. Many observed Ezra and came to realize the sinfulness of their actions. And Ezra was the catalyst that led them doing the right thing. One godly man who knows and obeys the Word of God can make an impact for God's glory. Just takes one though, right? Just one. Takes one who had the kind of commitment that Ezra had in 7:10. And God used him in a mighty way to bring about a reform for these people. We will jump to I thought we were going to do Nehemiah next, but it's probably good that I'm doing it this way. We'll go to Esther. chronological order is residing under the surface. I don't even know it's happening, and it happens. Yeah, there you go. Hence the title, God's Providential Care. Ezra's a book that's really never been challenged as far as its canonicity. But Esther's book has been challenged, questioned from time to time. And I believe that by the time of Christ, the Old Testament canon was acknowledged and affirmed, although there were discussions that happened afterward. But I believe that the canon was officially recognized by the time of Christ, because when you look at all of the interaction between Christ and the religious leaders, there's never any kind of interaction about a book in the canon. It's always about interpretation, right? But it's never about canonization. And even the statements in reference to the law and the prophets is an acknowledgement to the entirety of the Old Testament. So, you're hung up on the word canon?
Yeah.
Canon is the term that we used in reference to like all of Scriptures. So if we talk about the canon of the Old Testament, it is those books that have been recognized to be divinely inspired books, and they're a part of what we call the canon, the order or the standard. It comes from the word kanon, which was used in Hebrew, was a measuring reed, right?
That's all you had to say.
I know. See, I knew that if I just struck that note with you. So it was used for measuring, and so that's what, when they used the term canon, was measured up to be divine and inspired, and that which fell within, then they used it as a technical term as canon.
Thank you.
So Esther, God's providential care. Esther, this book complements Ezra. It describes the fascinating story of God's providence that transpired back in Persia while many of God's people were resettling in Palestine. It is an account that shows how God's chosen people were spared extermination during their exilic years, and is a story that should inspire and increase trust in God, who sovereignly controls world history and preserves his own children. I mean, when you look at it, you cannot help but see the sovereignty of God all the way through the pages of this book. The title is assigned to this book because Esther is the main character. Jews call the book Megilloth Esther, or Esther roll, because it is one of the 5 rolls, or the 5 Megilloth: Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And it was assigned reading along with other books during particular Jewish holidays. They all had their designated time when they were read, and so she is grouped with them. The date: Esther takes place between the first return under Zerubbabel in 536 BC and the second return of Ezra in 558 BC. Esther did not become queen until the 7th year of Xerxes' reign in 478 BC, after his return from his defeat in Greece at 480 BC. The document as it stands could have been written sometime between 470 and 465 during the latter years of Xerxes' reign. However, the comments that we find in 10:2 and following seem to indicate that the end of Xerxes' reign. If this is so, then the date of the writing would be no later than the reign of his son Artaxerxes of 464 to 423 BC. You'll notice in some of the intros too, I think it's Habakkuk is one of them. There's several interesting thoughts in regards to the dating of Habakkuk and that, and that's part of the sort of the lengthy process of writing the introductory material, is going through all the different views and weighing which ones are worth mentioning and not mentioning. But I think I mentioned a few in there, and also even the history of his name, why he was named that. There's some interesting discussion, but I think really the final decision maker is the text itself when we look at the prophecy and how it refers to him. But we try to figure everything as exactly as possible. We can only deal with the facts that we're given, so sometimes we can't have that exact date, but we can sure get close, right? Key elements to Esther, key words: providence of God. Key chapters: chapter 6, the hand of God changes the situation. Key verses: chapter 4, verses 13 through 14, 6:13, 8:17, and 9:26 through 28. And then the key characters: Mordecai, Esther, Haman, and Ahasuerus. And then the geography is the land of Persia. So beginning out in the first 5 chapters, we have the royal crisis for God's people. We have Queen Vashti is deposed in chapter 1. And this is going to set a stage for us. But the first chapter sets the stage for the story by informing the reader of the removal of the Persian Queen Vashti. Her husband, King Ahasuerus, demanded that she appeared before him and the leaders of the nation, and she refused, and in his anger and humiliation, the king removed her from her position as queen, and the stage has been set. In chapter 2, we have Esther becomes the queen. In order to fulfill the vacancy of the queen, nationwide beauty contest was held in chapter 2, verse 3, and she was going to be among those who were a part of this. Notice chapter 2, verse 3, let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, and to the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. So young women would join the king's harem, and then the king would decide which one would become his queen in replace of Vashti. Esther, the Jewish, was become a part of this situation. We find in chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. And having lost her parents, was raised by her cousin Mordecai, and she was instructed not to reveal that she was Jew. And then Esther was the winner of the contest, and then she becomes a queen. And it's just, again, it's interesting because we see the sovereign hand of God moving through all of the events that happen, although there isn't this direct reference, but yet you just see God at work. We have Haman's murderous plot in chapter 3. The king elevated Haman to a position of great authority in the Persian kingdom, but Haman became offended by the Jew Mordecai, and in his anger Haman decided to get rid of all the Jews. Mordecai's intercession comes in chapter 4 of Esther. This is where Esther learns of Haman's plot. Mordecai became to understand the Jews were scheduled for destruction because of the actions, and persuaded Esther, the queen, to intervene on behalf of the Jews, and at great risk to her own self, right? I mean, just having to trust and to go and to do, and therefore God's still working through all of that. But Esther receives favor in chapter 5. At the risk of her own life, Esther approaches the king. She asks him to come to a banquet, and it was at the banquet that she would make her appeal, and Haman was to come also. And that leads us into the second part of Esther's book, starting in chapter 6. And this is where the king plans to honor Mordecai. And he's going to receive honor in chapter 6. And through a divinely set arranged circumstances, Haman was forced to publicly praise Mordecai the Jew, the man he hated. To Haman's wife and friends, this indicated that Haman was doomed. And their viewpoint suggests that the unseen hand of God had often moved on behalf of his people. So again, God was just constantly at work through this book, and we see him work in the life of Esther as he's going to use her to deliver his people from extinction in one sense. Haman's execution in chapter 7. This comes on the heels of Esther's plea, but at the banquet Esther pleaded for her own life and pointed to Haman as the villain in the matter. The king, who did not have the slightest idea what was going on, was engaged in order to execution of Haman, and the Jews then are avenged in chapter 8. Mordecai is going to be promoted, but the law that allowed the Jews to be killed could be changed. In the Persian society, the law was greater than any person, even the king. So once the law had been enacted, it could not be annulled, but another law could be instituted that could counteract the previous law. So once the law was established, they couldn't change it, but they could establish another law that would counterbalance that or to come against that. And so the way that they did that was that they allowed the Jews the right to do what? Anybody know the story? All right, gave them the right to defend themselves. There's always a way around, right? And then chapter 9, we have Purim instituted, the annual Jewish feast of Purim, which came out of these events in Persia and celebrates the Jews' deliverance from their enemies. And then Mordecai becomes the premier in chapter 10. King elevated Mordecai to a position of great prominence in his kingdom. In that position, Mordecai was used to help the Jews of their Persian Empire. And that brings us to Nehemiah. So Nehemiah, building for security. Nehemiah is this, to me, is a great book. There's been several have gone to Nehemiah to draw from it principles for business. which is very fascinating. And I have actually a commentary, and that's its main focus. And it would be an interesting read for Christian businessmen to go through. But Nehemiah, to me, is fascinating. It's his prayer life. And it's interesting to watch, there are moments where he just offers up a quick prayer. There's a reference to him praying, but there isn't any kind of, lengthy explanation of what he prayed. And sometimes it was just in a moment. And the first time I realized that, I just realized, this is something that's so awesome about being able to communicate with God. Les and I were talking about prayer the other day, and so she, asked me how many times a day do I pray or whatever. And do I have a set time that I pray when I read? And I said, yeah, but I said, I also talk to the Lord during the day. I said, just the other day I was driving in the car to do something, and I just started talking to God. I'm like, God, I'm just not understanding this. And I just have these conversations with him, and I don't start off with, oh, dear Heavenly Father, and I just talk to God, And that to me was such a beautiful thing about Nehemiah, is that he would just sometimes offer up these prayers, like his interaction with the king. It just says he prayed to the Lord, and then he just responds and gives an answer. And it's one of those things, just a reminder of that we can just commune with God anytime, anywhere. It doesn't have to be some lengthy, long, exposition, whatever. It can be just a simple conversation, a quick, God, what do I do right now? What do I say right now? Right? How do I behave right now? And the fact is that he will answer, right? And he will give us what we need to know. So this sort of a grand scheme of all that's happening, Babylon, Jerusalem, and the journey that it would take going all the way back over. I give you a better map over here of the layout, going from Babylon to Jerusalem. This wasn't an easy journey for the returnees, either under Zerubbabel or under Ezra, under Nehemiah. I mean, it was quite a trek to head back. And there was only certain routes that they could take because of the provision, the necessity, right? I mean, if you're taking a journey in our days and you're thinking gas and all that, and you're going to try and think of the best route, the most convenient route, right? You're going to start, calculating food and gas and all of these other things, rest areas, right? If you're traveling with kids, how many pit stops you have to make. These are things that you calculate. And in those days, even more serious, because you need water, you need food along the way. You can't necessarily haul enough for the entire journey and all of that. So there was only aspects of that they had to work out and figure out what they did. So this was not an easy trek for them. But there were those who were so committed at heading back that they were willing to make that journey, even under the protection. But we have the introduction, the purpose of Nehemiah. The book was written to show the work of God through a godly leader, Nehemiah. The book records the building, fortifying, and the reestablishing of the city of Jerusalem. And this is what's awesome, is that, again, the order that they took when they came back, you understood that those who were returning were concerned with their relationship with God. The altar was first. Then they can start sacrificing. Then the foundation went, and then the temple went. And then the focus was then on the walls and our protection and our security and all of that. But it's just interesting. We read Nehemiah and the way that he surveys everything, and he goes and he looks at the job that has to be done, and he surveys the entirety of it, and then he starts to plot his course as far as how they're going to conquer it and to do the task at hand. There's a lot of great lessons that we can draw from there. Keywords: political restoration. Key chapter, chapter 6, the completion and rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. Key verses, chapter 1, verses 4 through 11, chapter 2, verse 17, 5, 14, and chapter 6, verse 15. The key characters: Nehemiah, Artaxerxes, and Ezra. And again, Cyrus was the one who gave the decree to allow the first return. Artaxerxes was the one who gave the decree for the second and the third return. And the geography: Persia and Palestine. Characteristics: the atmosphere of the book and the tone tend to be intense. And if you list to just give you some references, and all of them are just the beginning of the chapters, but just some thoughts to when you read through Nehemiah in your own time and look at some of these characteristics. Also, the simplicity of the writing lends to a tone of the text. Each section builds upon the last. You have the plans that come, the reconstruction, the resettlement, the revival, the redistribution, the rededication. And so we see all of these elements building one upon the other as you walk through the book. And so there's some order to it, which is very fascinating, because when you look at Nehemiah, what he has to do, it is an issue of orderliness, right? And that was what he was there for. Note the main transition in the book, chapter 7, verse 73, the second part of the verse, 7:1 through 73a, belong to the first part of the book because it emphasizes the aspect of physical security, where chapter 7, verse 73b and the following will focus on building for spiritual security. And again, all these are important. I'm trying to just find the author's path, and these transitions help us in discovering those things. So we have this aspect of work builders, worship dwellers. We have focus wall, focus law. We have leadership by a man, revival of a nation. And we see this interaction going on through Nehemiah. And so even though it is not a very lengthy book, 13 chapters, it's not super, super long, but there is a lot of great truth that is contained therein. So we have the rebuilding of the walls that come in chapter 1 through chapter 6, verse 14, Nehemiah's prayer voice in chapter 1, the report from Jerusalem is going to come as to the status, and that is what moves him in his heart and ends up leading to his interaction with the king, and then his request being made known. And the response from Nehemiah in chapter 1, verse 4, if you notice with me, and when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So there wasn't a favorable report that came back to him in regards to the condition of the city. And so therefore it brought brokenness to him, and his desire was to return to the land, and he wanted to go back and help to establish the building of the walls. So his response to him was he mourned, he fasted, and then he prayed. And then the request from Nehemiah comes in chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. I said, I beseech you, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. And again, it's just amazing, even Nehemiah, right? The inclusion of himself in the issue of sin, as he confesses the sin of the nation, he includes himself in that. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. So he's going to call upon him to remember, but we're going to have the request that's going to come. But Nehemiah faces a situation that he knew that he could not solve in and of himself, but he knew that all things were possible with God. So he begins his prayer by acknowledging that fact. And this is the first of several references to prayer throughout this book. And again, I mean, that to me is one of the things that struck me about Nehemiah. It wasn't the sense of, learning great principles for, being a Christian businessman, although some have drawn that from there. To me, the impact was the issue of his prayer life. And you need to be praying people is what we need to be. But he acknowledges God's greatness, chapter 1, verse 5. He refers to him as the Lord. This is the covenant relationship with Israel. He refers to him as the God of heaven. This refers to his sovereignty. The great and awesome God. He refers to his power and majesty. And he begins with this adoration, right, of exalting and lifting up God. It's such a great lesson for us in prayer, right? When we begin in our prayers to God, we need to begin with just exalting God and lifting him up. It's interesting, by the time we get done doing that and we get done thanking him for things he's already done for us, it starts to change our supplications a little bit, doesn't it? Or sometimes a lot of it. He acknowledges Israel's sins in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Notice how he places himself in a submissive attitude under God, your servant, your servants, as he talks about the nation, your servant. And then he appeals for God's help in chapter 1, verses 8 through 11. But again, the issue of the exaltation of God, right? The diminishing of man, the subservience of man, and then he gives his request to God. These are great lessons for our prayer life. Nehemiah's prayer is answered in chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. We have Nehemiah's response and the response of the king in 2, 1 through 4a. And then we have Nehemiah's request to the king and then Nehemiah's recognition of God's hand in chapter 2, verse 8b. Nehemiah's preparation for the work begins in chapter 2, verses 9 through 20. Nehemiah's arrival in Jerusalem in 2:9 through 10. And then we have Nehemiah surveys the walls, and Nehemiah challenges the people. And again, this is great because he knows that there's a task at hand. There's something he has to do. He goes and he surveys the job, right? He checks everything out. He sees what all the needs are. What does the task look like? Therefore, it enabled him to be able to calculate, well, what do we need to fulfill this task? Great lesson for doing a job, right? You walk onto a job site, survey the job site. Take time to walk around and see everything that needs to be done. Look at it from every angle, and then begin to plot your strategy of how you're going to accomplish that. And that is definitely one of the things that Nehemiah did. And then Nehemiah's delegation for the work in chapter 3. Workers he establishes on the north wall, and this is how he just lays them out. He's walked, he's surveyed the need, he looks at all that needs to be done, and he starts dividing up the task force and establishing where they were going to work, what they were going to do, and how they would accomplish what they needed to get done. And this is the layout of the construction that went on. This was not an easy task for him to undertake, but it was one that was necessary, especially if they were going to permanently reside there. They needed protection, they needed that security, they needed the protection for the city itself, and so it was not an insignificant task, it was a major one, but nonetheless there was no better man to do that. And it's just interesting to watch God and the people that he used in the process. Who was Nehemiah though? What was he in relation to the king? The cupbearer. Just think about that, a cupbearer. And God's going to use him to do what? Build a wall. You see, it's so fascinating to me. So oftentimes we define who we think we are. I can't do this, God. There's no way I can do that. God's just saying, just relinquish yourself into my hand and let me use you how I can use you. And it's amazing the things that God will do through us if we just let go and let him do it. But he can take a cupbearer and use him in such a significant way as this, and not just rebuilding the wall, but he also brought reform to the people. So this was the layout in relation to the temple, and again, they began with the altar, the foundation for the temple, and then they worked on the wall. Nehemiah's reactions to opposition, chapter 4, opposition from without. Nehemiah's handling of the internal problems, opposition from within, comes in chapter 5, verses 1 through 13. Nehemiah's service as a governor in 5:14 through 19, and his response to opposition against him personally in 6:1 through 14. I mean, that's the thing. You're going to step up. Listen, you're going to be the driver. You're going to have a lot of backseat drivers. That's just a fact. Anytime you step into a role of leadership, you're going to run into opposition, right? And then just everywhere you see it, whether it was Moses or whether it was Joshua, whoever it was, there's always going to be, that issue of opposition when you take the leadership role. And I think that's why sometimes some don't want to step in that role because they know it's inevitable. It's going to come, right? You get in the front seat and you hear Tristan in the back, Dad, you sure you know where you're going? You sure you're making the right turn? Son, I've driven these streets for years. I know where I'm going, right? But see, it's going to happen, right? And some would prefer that. They'd rather just be the backseat driver. I don't want to take the responsibility up front, but I'll sit back here and tell you what to do from the back. And then we have the reconstruction completed, the resettling the people in 6:15 through 7:3a. We have the completion of the wall, the security of the city, the census of the returnees that come, and then the restoration of the people in chapters 7:73 through 13. And again, in this section we have what we looked at before in chapter 8, where Ezra reads the law and explains the law and the magnitude of what happened in his ministry there. I mean, you just think about the length of time they spent listening to the reading of the law. Right? From the light, right? The break of day to noon. So they're spending at least 6 hours at least standing and listening to the reading of the law, then the explaining of the law. And it wasn't just merely exposition. It's an appropriate translation where they render it translated the law. And some have suggested that he gave such careful reading to the law, that he gave the accurate intonations and all that was necessary in reading the language, then went into explaining the details of it and giving that explanation. This was true exegetical preaching that was taking place in Nehemiah chapter 8. And the restoration that comes, I mean, it's amazing, the reform. And all the people then are going to respond. All the people are going to affirm their commitment to the covenant. From the heads, the leaders, all the way down to everyone who could understand, the heads of the households and so on. Everyone affirmed their commitment to the covenant. And there was great rejoicing. And I love that, because that really what it was. It was to become a time of festivity and rejoicing. But see, when you think about the church, if we want to have great joy and rejoicing, it's got to be around a sound handling of the Word. When we're nourished on the Word and fed on the Word and we know the Word accurately, then great rejoicing comes as a result of that, right? Because we're rejoicing in God and glorying in God, but you can't do that without sound teaching and sound doctrine. I was just reminded just recently, I was reading a segment by John Piper, and he was dealing with this exact issue. People want to have joy in God, they want to glory in God, but he says you cannot do that if you're not willing to be faithful to the Word of God. So we have the list of the Judean residences in chapter 11, verse 1 through chapter 12, verse 26. The dedication of the wall in chapter 12, verse 27 through 47. And then the reforms under Nehemiah in chapter 13. But God was going to use three major men to bring about a restoration to the land, starting with Zerubbabel in the spiritual aspect. You got Ezra, the aspect of committing the people to the law of God and understanding of it, and the Nehemiah coming in, building the wall, but also the reforms that he came and the restoration he brought. And that closes us to the last part of our survey, the era of restoration. Malachi is the last to give us word, and that leads us into the 400 silent years. So next time we will come and we'll talk about what happened in that 400 silent years, and then we will talk about New Testament.